Everybody, it's great to see a full house here. This is terrific. And Senator Toomey, that was a terrific speech. I want to thank you for the speech and the comments you made. I want to thank you for your outstanding leadership. But as a Republican who served on the House Ways and Means Committee, who also focused on trade, and I just left at the end of 2016, it's encouraging to see a fellow Republican standing up on these issues. I went back and looked at the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, and it was interesting. There were three basic objectives laid out in that legislation, one being strong economic growth for the United States. A second issue or objective was helping our allies, our market, free market countries and allies around the world, not only in Europe but in Asia as well, to embark in free trade with tariff lowering and so forth. And then thirdly, it was to push back on the Soviet-led communist bloc. And it's interesting, when you read further down, you go into Section 231, it prohibits the use of this tariff-lowering authority in that legislation with regard to application to the communist bloc. And then Section 232, you've covered a good bit of it about national security with the lack of a definition. But it's interesting now, if you fast forward to today, there's this interesting irony, because we're dealing with the threat of China and its abusive trade practices, and we need allies. And you talked about this. So I think, in my view, your legislative proposal, which is brilliant, it's balanced, is an important tool in helping us to build alliances to deal with a broader threat that China poses. And, but let's talk a little bit about prospects. You've done a lot of work. You now have 13 co-sponsors, companion bill in the House with bipartisan support. Senator Grassley, it's encouraging, to hear his strong remarks on this. My concern is, what happens? Do you think this? What's the risk of this getting watered down?
Well, there's always some risk of that. But at this point, this is why I stress the comments that Senator Grassley has consistently made, that for him, he's a free trader. He, I think, would like to see the steel and aluminum tariff. I don't want to speak for him, but I think he would prefer to see the steel and aluminum tariffs go away. But he has not focused exclusively on that. He has focused his comments on restoring congressional responsibility where the Constitution assigns it. So I take that as an encouraging sign that we end up with something. It won't be identical to my bill, but I'm hoping that it will be substantively equivalent.
Right. I know Senator Portman has legislation which differs from yours. Some of the audience may be familiar with it, but could you kind of highlight some of the differences?
Sure. So there's one fundamental similarity and one fundamental difference. The similarity is both of our bills reassign the responsibility for determining a threat to national security from the Commerce Department to the Defense Department. Both of our bills do that. The big difference is my bill then precludes the possibility of imposing these tariffs unless Congress acts to provide its assent, and Senator Portman's bill does not. His bill does restate that Congress can always pass a law if it's got the votes to repeal a tariff, but that is just existing law, right? I mean, we could do that today, right? Today, if we had the votes, we could pass a law in the House, pass a law in the Senate, the President would veto it, a law rescinding the 232 tariffs, excuse me. But obviously we don't have the ability to do that, and so the tariffs are in place. Under my legislation, the tariffs never go in place in the first place unless Congress provides its assent. So it's a fundamentally different approach. Mine restores to Congress its constitutional responsibility, and Senator Portman's does not.
Do you expect Senator Grassley to author his own bill, or how do you see this playing out at this stage?
Yeah, so what I think it's fair to say, I think it's consistent with Senator Grassley's public statements, is he's working with a group of interested senators, myself, Democrats, and I think his hope is to come up with a piece of legislation that would reflect a consensus within the Finance Committee and hopefully a broader consensus within the Senate. So it might, as I say, it will be something different than my bill per se, but hopefully substantively equivalent.
I know last year Senator Corker took an interest in this and managed to get a non-binding resolution passed. He had difficulty in building support. The issue wasn't quite ripe yet. I don't think the full impact of the tariffs had been felt. Many who don't follow trade didn't have a deeper understanding of what all this meant, and certainly the constitutional aspects of this, the abrogation of congressional authority and so forth, all the things you just mentioned. But I know that back then, the leader, Senator McConnell, was a little ambivalent or cool toward the issue. He's been fairly quiet so far in this debate. Now, understanding the Senate is a deliberative body, and if enough momentum builds, especially bipartisan momentum, there's a good opportunity or a chance that he will allow this to go forward. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic? Are you comfortable?
Well, when you're the elected majority leader, there's a natural tendency, a natural inclination, some would say a responsibility, to prioritize legislation that has very, very broad support within your party, right? That's understandable. So I'm sure that the level of Republican support for this will inform Senator McConnell's opinion about devoting floor time to this. But let me be very clear. The Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body that contemplates amendments on all kinds of legislation. Now, we haven't been, right? We've been completely dysfunctional, and we've not been having an appropriate amendment process. But if we've got broad bipartisan support for this, then we ought to be able to find an opportunity to insist on an amendment vote where the consensus legislation is offered as an amendment to some must-pass legislation. And if we've got enough support to get it across the goal line, we'll need more than 60 votes, preferably more than 67. That's a high hurdle. That's going to be really tough. But I do think it's possible. And that's another way to move this forward, even if Senator McConnell chooses not to devote a week of floor time to this debate.
Right. Well, I know philosophically I've always been very much aligned with you with regard to trade policy and reasserting congressional authority. And you and I both worked on the latest iteration of Trade Promotion Authority, which was passed in 2015, where we tried to claw back, or at least put a number of provisions in place that would bring back more congressional input into trade agreements. So I really appreciate the effort you're making here. One last question I have on this, and I want to open up to the audience because I think a number of folks here will have questions. I get the sense that this is really, the forces are starting to converge in your favor on this for a number of reasons. One, the threat of auto tariffs, 232 tariffs are out there, which is going to really exercise a lot of others' concerns in all of this, because you got a lot of auto dealers and the industry is a big industry. So you have that. There's also the fact that we have USMCA sitting out there, and as much as some want to separate the 232 tariff issue from USMCA, I don't think you can separate those. So it seems to me that these things are converging in your favor to force the issue.
I think you may well be right. And I'm glad you brought us USMCA because, in fairness to the administration, and I probably should have mentioned this in my remarks, I think one of the defenses the administration would use for invoking 232 is that it gave them the leverage to force the Canadians and Mexicans to renegotiate NAFTA. So I will concede that those tariffs probably did play a role in bringing Canada and Mexico to the table. The problem I have is that the goal of our administration in renegotiating NAFTA was to diminish trade. Right? And so if you look at the renegotiated NAFTA, what does it do? It puts a sunset provision, which I think is a terrible idea, to have a trade agreement that expires and therefore dramatically diminishes the incentive to make investments and engage in long-term trade. It virtually eliminates the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, and that is a very, very helpful mechanism for American investment. We have that in, I think, virtually every trade agreement we've ever reached, and it has served American interests very, very well. And then, of course, it explicitly is designed to dramatically limit trade in automobiles with quotas and minimum wages and tariffs. And so there are some good things in the USMCA, right? You've got a digital title that is constructive. There's some additional protection for certain categories of American intellectual property. But the administration, in my judgment, used the 232 tariffs to negotiate agreement that diminishes trade. So not a good outcome.
Do you think this Section 232 issue, as it relates to USMCA passage, could it be a barrier to getting votes?
Yeah, so I think the path forward is very difficult on USMCA, and I actually urge the administration to work with free traders like me, making some changes to the implementing legislation last year that would, would diminish the push against free trade, not requiring that it be reopened, the negotiations, and then pass it while they still had a Republican House. I clearly was not very persuasive, and the path forward now is not very clear to me at all, but I will say I cannot envision how they could possibly pass it if they keep steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico. They might be able to keep it in other countries, but on those two countries, just my political judgment, as difficult as it is under any circumstance, it strikes me as almost impossible to ratify USMCA unless steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada and Mexico are lifted.
Thank you. Let's open up for questions in the audience. I'd ask that you stand up, just state who you are, who you're with, and then we'll go from there.
And try to keep your questions short.
Yes. Questions?
Hi, it's Paul Nathanson. I represent the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users. We're small, medium-sized metal associations, fasteners, metal formers. We very much support your bill. I was just wondering, with compromise legislation, what's the likelihood for us, obviously, the retroactivity for the bill to apply to the current steel 232 tariffs on aluminum? What's the likelihood of that still being in the bill when we have it finalized? Thank you.
I think in fairness, that's going to be an issue that's going to have to be litigated, right? That's one of the controversial. I mean, most of this is controversial, but that's one of the more controversial parts. I don't know how it actually ends up. That is still a subject of discussion between myself and Senator Grassley and other interested parties, so I honestly can't tell you how that turns out.
Next question. There we go.
Hi, I'm Jutta Hennig. I'm wondering if you could take on the question of how much resolve is there in the GOP to take on the president on that. So far, some people might say the GOP has become officially a spine-free zone. So, is there enough resolve to take this on, or would it, and to what extent do you see the automotive tariffs, if they were to be imposed, energizing that opposition? And do you make a qualitative distinction between 232 on autos or 232 on autos and auto parts? How much momentum, qualitative distinction of how much momentum would be generated as a pushback against the current 232 and for new legislation?
Okay, so you put a lot on the table there. If the administration were to impose 232 tariffs on autos and auto parts, I think that would be devastating to the American economy. There would be a huge backlash, probably in every congressional district in America. Obviously, it would be concentrated in some places. But this, I think, would be very, very harmful. It would be perceived as such. And so, would it give some momentum to our bill? Probably would. Probably would, as a practical political matter. I still certainly hope that the administration does not go down this road. It is my view that last summer, the President and EU Commissioner Juncker announced a mutual non-escalation agreement, and that we're still operating under the mutual non-escalation agreement. Now, I understand Europeans have been less willing to negotiate over admittedly bad agricultural policies than our administration would like. And so at some point, I don't know whether they will continue to, they being our administration, will continue to view us operating under the mutual non-escalation agreement. But that's where I think we are now with respect to Japan. separately, but also the EU. If that were to change, then all bets are off, because I think it would be very, very problematic for our economy. I have to also defend my colleagues a little bit here. If you look at it, the president says and tweets many very controversial things, but there's a very long list of, I think, really substantive and really important and constructive policies that we have enacted together because they have been in furtherance of Republican orthodoxy. The tax reform that Bill mentioned was a very big deal and completely consistent with Republican principles and values. So of course Republicans worked with President Trump on that. Regulatory relief, same story. Judicial nominees, same story. So when the president is pursuing a pro-growth agenda that's consistent with Republican values, naturally Republicans are working with him. And when we think that maybe there's a departure from some important Republican principles, many of us have been willing to stand up and disagree. When the president, for instance, announced a nearly complete withdrawal from Syria, many of us thought that would jeopardize our security, and we publicly pushed back on the president. The National Emergency Declaration, I think good conservatives can disagree on that. I was one of the 12 that thought that was not a good idea and voted accordingly. So I think, and on trade, look, we've got Republican co-sponsors on my bill. So I think there's a willingness to respectfully disagree with the president when we think he's wrong, just as there's a enthusiasm for working with him when we think he's right.
Next question.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I was interested in Grassley's attempt at bridging the gap between the vetoable approach with Portman's bill and your bill, in the sense of only letting the tariffs continue with congressional assent. And I wondered if you could support that if the tariffs were time limited to 90 days or to 1 month.
So I trust you'll understand that I'd rather not negotiate the bill here and now. I understand the mechanism you are describing. Let me just say it is a subject of conversation.
Next question.
Thank you. Allison Winters from Americans for Prosperity, and Senator, I just wanted to thank you for your really principled leadership on this issue. And my question is, we've read a lot in the past week or two about replacing the metals tariffs with quotas in USMCA, as happened in Chorus. So sort of two questions. Where do you see that going, and how might your legislation and the work that's being done by Senator Grassley address that as an issue? Thank you.
I think it's a very important point, because I do think there's a school of thought within the administration that if the 232 tariffs are lifted, they are replaced with quotas. Now, the quotas, the devil's in the detail. If you had enormously high quotas, they wouldn't matter very much. I don't think that's what they have in mind. So our legislation applies to really any of the devices that would be invoked under 232. So that would include quotas as well as tariffs.
Next question. Right here, right front.
Kat Lucero with MLEX. This is more towards steel, but yesterday, a lot of the major steel companies in the U.S. have been asking to keep the 232 tariffs, but they've also addressed the transshipments and circumventions. What is Congress or you doing to perhaps kind of rein in that issue, or pushing Commerce or Customs to regulate that problem?
So, my focus clearly has been more on 232, but I think we have a pretty robust regime for identifying and dealing with transshipments. That is obviously an attempt to circumvent whatever existing laws and treaties are in place that are being misused. So, the Commerce Department has the tools for dealing with that.
Next question. Here we go.
Nicole Bivens-Collison with Sam and Travis Rosenberg. Just following on that question with respect to the transshipment issue. We've seen several instances where the Department of Commerce has determined that goods which were steel, and I'm not a steel expert, so I'm going to show my ignorance, but let's say it's a hot rolled product, it goes from China, it goes into Vietnam, it's transformed into a cold rolled product. According to our customs, our laws, everything that's been put in place heretofore, it is a product of Vietnam. It's then shipped to the United States as a product of Vietnam, and it's outside of the anti-dumping or countervailing duties. Now we've got these steel tariffs in place as well. Where do you see, with respect to the transshipment, where the administration is actually, again, exceeding its, what I would say, its authority in determining what has been transshipped when we have laws and everything that have been in place to determine what is an origin of a good?
Yeah, I haven't drilled down enough in this to have a well thought through opinion on it. I mean, it's a fair point, but I'd have to study it before I could give you a good answer on that.
Another question?
Good morning, Senator Deanna Oken, Adusi Mastriani, and Schomburg. With the attention that your legislation is focused and the chairman focused on Section 232 legislation, do you think that you will also be focusing on engaging the administration on pending 232s? We have, of course, autos out there, uranium, and most recently titanium sponge. The attention of Congress certainly helped, I think, focus attention on improving Section 232, how Commerce was administering it. But I'm curious whether your efforts are also to try to engage the administration as you try to get legislation for the next round.
Well, yes. I mean, I have certainly, and I'm not alone, certainly among Republican senators in engaging with the administration, across a range of trade issues, and certainly any future round of 232 tariffs. I think the president has a very good idea of where Republican senators are. Republican senators are pretty free trade as a general matter. So I think that message has been delivered repeatedly. I had a group of colleagues that were at the White House just last week on this issue yet again. So I imagine that we will continue to drive that message.
Another question? Got one couple in the back and then up here.
Thanks. Senator David Lynch with the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you just to elaborate a little bit on your USMCA comments. How do you see the timing of this evolving? Does this need to get done before the August recess, before the end of the year? And do you see any sort of emerging bargain in terms of what the administration might offer the Democrats to get Speaker Pelosi and her folks on board?
Yes. So the administration is, as you know, in discussions with the Speaker's office on this very topic. I'm not in the room, so I don't know exactly what they're negotiating. But they've got a pretty high hurdle, right? I think there were 90 Democrat House members who come out and unequivocally stated their opposition to the agreement. The environmental movement across the board has really aggressively panned it. Organized labor has been critical. I don't perceive them to have closed the door on this entirely, but they've certainly been very critical of the agreement. So they've got some serious hurdles, and I think what you're alluding to, which is the clock, is not their friend, right? We have how many Democrat senators running for president already, maybe more going to get into the race. Which of them are going to endorse Donald Trump's NAFTA 2.0? I'm pretty sure that number is 0. And as this Democratic primary gets ever more engaged, doesn't it become even more difficult for Speaker Pelosi to move a ratification of agreement that every one of them is adamantly opposed to? I think it's hard to see how that works out. So I do think they've got a short clock on this. I don't know exactly when it runs out, but this is why I suggested that they may want to take a different tack last fall, but they decided otherwise.
Another question?
Americans are good consumers, and buying a car is a big deal, especially when you're talking about a 25% tax on that car. Do you foresee, if you recall cash for clunkers, people bought cars early and then they didn't buy cars for a considerable period of time, which really slowed the economy. If the tariff threat on cars become truly credible, do you see a big pre-buy followed by a no-buy?
I think, you know, you'd have to figure that would be very likely, right? People are rational. People will behave in ways that are in their economic interest. If there's a consensus view starts to emerge that we're about to get a huge tax increase on cars, yeah, I would think people would have that tendency. I'm not sure how much warning we'll get, you know, so it may be that there's just complete uncertainty till all of a sudden there's an announcement, in which case people may not have a lot of opportunity to do that. But yeah, I think if people have a rational basis for believing that tariffs are coming, they'll behave accordingly. And so absolutely a surge of buying followed by a real drought, I think would be a likely outcome.
One more question right here.
I'm Len Bickwit with Miller and Chevalier. You mentioned the possible scenario of an amendment to a must-pass piece of legislation. Are you willing to be drawn out at all on what that might be and what the strategy might look like, what the timing might look like?
No, no, and no.
I didn't think so.
Well, that concludes our Q&A session. Please join me in thanking Senator Toomey.
Thanks very much.